Okay, step one of replacing the transmission or transfer gear in a Nissan Leaf. Acquire one from the junkyard. I got one for about 300 bucks from LKQ. Step two, jack up the car and remove the driver's side tire. Not going to go through instructions for this. I used the subframe corners as jacking points on both sides, just like that. And step three, unhook 12 battery with two 10mm nuts. Then pull the battery bracket out of the way and you can lift the battery up. What you have to do is pull up the little plastic plate in the middle of the rear seats, take off three 10mm nuts and this battery protector plate, and then remove the battery connector, which comes out. Okay, it took me a bit to get it started, hard with one hand, but make sure you have electrical gloves on, and then pull up on the green bit in the back. This piece here starts coming up, and then keep pulling, and it rotates up. It needs to rotate up more. Oh, there it is. Until you get it vertical, and then the green piece is vertical, and you can just pull the whole thing up, just like that. And this is just an inline disconnect, essentially. So one of those terminals down there is live right now. So put this cover back on. Next, pull the battery base, and then four 12mm or 13mm bolts holding on the bottom, and pull back on these two tabs on the fuse box, and this pops off, and then with our pliers squeeze this one, this, and this, and then this whole thing comes out. I'm not sure yet how critical it is to remove the battery tray completely, but it just gives us easy access to some of the bolts from above that hold the transmission mount on, and then also to some of the top bolts in the transmission. And next step is going to be removing the axle. As we start with the axle, the first step is removing or draining out the transmission oil. That's this drain plug right here. When you get it loose, screw it out, and let the oil out. I put in 75W90 oil a year ago when it started making noise. No real buildup since then. The noise only got a little bit louder though. The Nissan gear oil that's from the factory is a lot lower viscosity. Next, I'll remove the bolt off the steering knuckle. To get the steering knuckle bolt to pop off after removing the nut, I just hit the side of the cast iron portion of the spindle here with a large hammer, and that allows it to pop down. Let go. Next, we bend back the cotter pin on the axle, pull it out, pull the cover piece off, and take a 32mm and shoot it out. Off it goes. That's the axle bolt. Now this whole axle should move back. May have to motivate it with some hits from the hammer. Leave the nut on and hit the nut with the hammer to not mushroom the threads. It is nice and loose. Okay, next we'll remove the upper knuckle bolts. These are 13/16. And with these out of the way, the whole knuckle comes back. The steering knuckle actually you may not need to remove. This might be enough to already get the axle out. Just be careful with the brake line to not put too much strain on that. Probably leaning to the left here a bit more. So now that this knuckle is loose, we can just slide the axle bolt back, and the axle is loose in its housing. Now I would probably recommend zip tying this knuckle up here so that we don't accidentally damage the brake line by putting too much strain on it. And then we can pop the axle out. Okay, I couldn't get this part on video, but what I did was take a pry bar, put it under the axle in the transmission, and pry it to pop the axle out. And there it is, nice and clean. Okay, there's a little 10mm bolt holding on this front hose, so you can get that loose. And then there's a 13mm bolt holding on this back cable here, the positive 12-volt cable coming from the inverter housing. And then there's a little clip that holds on this breather hose, and it's a transmission breather hose. It just pops up and you can move out of the way. First, we have to install a piece of wood to hold up the engine or the electric motor as we start loosening the bolts for the transmission mount. These are loose, and then there's one on the top side here. Two on the top side.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah.
Daddy, where's the GoPro? Daddy, do that.
Hmm? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, see the engine already settled down a bit. So there's one mount we're going to get off.
Is it right there?
And there's a mounting bolt at the end of the mount right here. Pop this on.
This one?
Okay, once you get these 4 bolts off the front bracket, and that, so it fits up and out of the way for now. You'll also want to get off this plug. You just squeeze the top and push it in and then pull out and it pops out. Okay, next I just want to see if these bolts even fit by the steering rack. And luckily they do. So these are the mounting bolts for the rear transmission bracket. Back away, Magnus, a little bit so that people can see. So this and this, these 2 bolts in the bottom, and there's 2 bolts on the top. Those hold on to the rear bracket, and then we got to take, here, let's look down this way, Magnus. So we got the mounting bolts off the rear bracket off, all 4 of them. The transmission settled down a bit. Then there is one 16mm bolt here and one up here for the back of the transmission. And then so the passenger side axle has to come off as well. So rinse and repeat what you did on the other side. On the driver's side, take off the steering knuckle, take off the upper spindle bolts, and pull out the axle. Of course, the axle nut as well. And then we get in there to get to the, this is a longer axle, so there's some more bolts and hardware in there. So once you get the passenger side drive shaft out, the drive shaft bracket has to come off so you can get to the last bolt on the transmission. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts. One of them needs this deep socket 16 to get to at the very top here that I'm showing you now, and that should make this thing come off. And there's the last bolt on the transmission that you can't reach without pulling the passenger side drive shaft and bracket off. Okay, so one of the mounting bolts on the transmission on the front, it's a 16mm. There's the other one, front bottom, right here. Right here. There's also a mounting bolt in the top middle here. This one right here. You gotta get off. Once all the bolts are out, I was able to pry bar the bottom of the transmission and pull on it a bit, and it cracked the case right open. So now I'm going to use 2 hands to pull it off. It is. Slides right off. Oh, 30 or so pounds of it. Whew. Okay, so there's an O-ring on the drive shaft, or the spline. There's an O-ring on the spline coming out of the motor. That should ideally be replaced. I inspected mine and it was pretty soft. And then also add lithium grease for the factory service manual to this output spline before putting the new gearbox up. Okay, once you bench press this thing up, then it's just make sure you start by getting it lined up on the spline. I can't really see the crack, but get it on the spline gently and then push it in. The thing that fought me the most was this back motor mount bracket. That was not wanting to line up very well, but it went in. So now I start gently bolting it up and pulling it in. Once you get the 3 rear transmission bolts on, then you can put the drive shaft bracket back up here. Start with the deep socket bolt that goes to the top, and then get the other bolts. Once you get all the transmission bolts on, don't forget to mount up all the brackets. A little 10mm bolt holds the front harness, 13mm bolt holding the 12-volt cable, and getting the breather tube plugged into the transmission. Don't forget about the top bolt for the transmission as well. It's hidden behind the hook there. After you get the rear mount started, the bolts, all the mounts use the same 18mm bolts. Then get the front mount going. You're gonna have to jiggle the engine, the motor, and the transmission around to line up the bolt holes. And after that, we're back to the axles. In order to get these mount bolts started, put a check stand under the transmission and jack the engine up in order to line up the bolt holes on this front mount. And make sure you hand start all the bolts so you don't cross thread them. Okay, next, remove the field plug and plug in a 1/2-inch hose. This is 5/8 OD, 5/16 ID. Happens to fit in here fairly well. Shove it into the fill hole. And then from up above, put in fluid for the for the gear. Once you put the fluid in, you'll see if there's any leaks from the axle seals or anything before you button everything up completely. Pour in fluid from the top until it starts coming out the bottom, and then pull out the hose. Now we're full. Eee, let it mellow out a bit. We'll stop it when it's a little over full. It's good. For the steering knuckle bolts, you'll have to tighten them with a little star bit and a manual and a 14mm, because otherwise the whole shaft spins as you try to tighten this with a regular socket. I didn't take a video of this, but tighten the center axle nut while somebody else is hitting the brakes on the car. That's the easiest way while it's in the air. And then don't forget to torque everything down. Put torque specs into the video description. Don't forget to plug in all of these little clips afterwards. And then you're good to go.